listing agreement, and the reason we're covering the list agreement is because it was on the schedule. One of the other reasons we're doing it is because there's been some changes made to the listing agreement. And I want to make sure everybody knows that. I had made a comment about it. They've made changes to some of Texas Realtors forms already, and some of those forms are basic changes. For example, the short sale addendum, there was a change in the paragraph because it references the termination option, right? Which is now paragraph 5, starting 1 April, or whenever you use it between now and then. It's still not in zip forms. It's supposed to be in zip forms on the 22nd, but it is available through Texas Realtors and it is available through Trek. And I have already seen a couple of them being used. I'll take it back, just one being used. It was out of the Corpus Christi office. So the short sale addendum was one that had just a minor change, paragraph. Relocation addendum had some minor changes to it. There's a couple other little minor changes to addendums, but they're all like paragraph, change paragraph 23 to paragraph 20 to paragraph 5, that kind of thing. Nothing major. The contract changes become mandatory April the 1st. So April the 1st, we have to use the new contracts. If you are in a transaction and you're negotiating at the end of March and the effective date is March the 31st, you can still use this contract that we have. If the effective date is going to be on April the 1st, then you need a new contract. So if you're negotiating back and forth at the end of the month, please keep that in mind, that we need to be using the correct contract. If I'm starting a buyer says put an offer in on March the 31st, I'm probably going to write that up on the new contract, right? And again, by that time, it should be in zip form. Also on the 24th, I'm planning on doing just a 1 hour CE class with the company. It's a 1 hour CE class on TREC and TAR form changes for anybody that wants to attend. And I'll send that out in an email today or tomorrow. All right, any questions? So on the listing agreement, let's just go through this. If you have any tips or ideas on how to help make this work, please share them. Jump in. You can unmute or throw it in the chat. It doesn't matter either way. But let's touch base on a few of these things. And again, I have some things highlighted in here for you. Some of the changes and no, all the changes, and some of the other little things that are in here that we're not seeing that we might want to be aware of. One of the biggest parts of this, when we start off, make sure we have the parties. And when we talk about the seller, we want to make sure that we have the correct seller. If there's more than one person involved, we need to have everybody's name and signature. Everybody's name and signature. I think I've mentioned there's a transaction going on right now where there was 6 people involved in it. The listing agent was asked, do you have everything? They said yes. And 4 months later, we're still dealing with this stinking thing because the listing agent did not have everything. If you're the listing agent, make sure that you have all the documentation that you need for it. Ask the right questions, please. Just a tip, if the seller has a power of attorney and they live in Montana, get a copy of it, take it to one of the local title companies, ask them to take a look at it. Find out whether it's valid or not. It may not be any good in the state of Texas. You know, we do things different here, just a little bit, right? So we want to make sure that we, if there is any question about it, get it looked at by somebody. We talk about the property. I've highlighted on here, if the property is a condominium, attach the condominium addendum. That's something that was recently popped up. A lot of times when I look at a listing agreement, I don't necessarily look at all of the legal. I look, do you have something there? Yes. Okay. Do you have initials? Do you have signatures? Is there anything in special provisions? What have you put in the different areas? Now I'm starting to actually look at what do you have as far as lot and block and subdivision. And please remember right here, I need an address and a zip code is all that we need on there. Like 123 A Street, 78550. I don't have to put Harlingen because 78550 tells you it's in Harlingen, right? And you have the city of Harlingen up here, or whatever the city is. You already have that up here. You also have the county here. So I don't need to write that whole thing out here. And that is the idea of the way it's written. If we need to do an exhibit, this says attach an exhibit. Most of us know that all we need to do is go right above the forms and click on the icon for addenda, and it will create one for us. We write in paragraph 2, property, and then write in the rest of it, the legal description. So that's all. If we're using zip forms, that's the way to handle that. For those of you that are not, you can do it in zip forms a lot faster. Changes right here, improvements. What they have done right here, if you take a look at this, it says all other property, and it used to say the one you look at right now, if you're actually, this one's out of zip forms already. All other property owned by the owner is what the current one said, right? And they've taken that out. It says all other property attached to the above described real property. And the reason for that is now our focus is on items that may be attached that are leased. Items that may be attached that are leased. Solar panels, security systems, water softeners, things of that nature. They're attached, but they're not fixtures the way Texas does it, right? They're leased fixtures, not fixtures in that part. So that where I have the red lines is where they've taken things out. Like, for example, here they took out controls for satellite systems. Satellite systems is no longer in there. Wasn't my choice. I know there's still some satellite systems out there being used. I'm not sure why they took it out, but they did. And the blue is what they've added to this. So that's the change that went into the listing agreement. So when you're talking to the seller, you need to have a conversation with them about the security systems that are not fixtures. You need to talk about the controls, including the seller's transferable rights. And what are you going to do with them? You know, the software, the applications, any control improvements, accessories, the hardware, anything that you have to help control what we might call a smart home, for example, and what's going to happen with those items. So one of the things we need to find out about here is, can you transfer? Let's say I have a security system attached and I'm not taking it with me, it's staying. Can I transfer that security system to the new owner? If it's a lease, for example, can I transfer that to the new owner? And if so, what's it going to cost? We have to ask those questions to eliminate any problems with this, because that lease for fixtures will be attached to the contract if the agent's doing things correctly. So this is the new part of the listing agreement. This is a new part of it right here. Please make sure you have this conversation with the seller. Any questions on that one? So that is what's changed in the 1 to 4 family. It's also changed on the farm and ranch as well to include those items. And we'll do that on the 24th. Listing price. The seller will pay all typical closing costs. And the reason I have that highlighted is occasionally agents will say, hey, my seller said they weren't aware of this. What should I do? Well, not to point fingers, but if I'm a listing agent and the seller's not aware of it, I think that's my fault. I should have done an estimated net proceeds sheet. And in fact, we've talked about how we'll use a title company, use a title company's website, title company's app to do that estimated net sheet and provide that to the seller. And maybe, talking about limiting risk and liability, maybe even have the seller sign off on or initial that estimated net sheet so that we have proof that they actually took a look at it. All right.
About that, Mac, do we say like always is like a approximate amount, right? It's
right.
Not always exact amount.
Yes, ma'am. In fact, usually as a listing agent, the very top of it says estimated. So I'd always highlight that one so that they, first off, this is just an estimated closing statement, estimated cost based on what I know. And that's one of the reasons why I want to use the title companies, is because most of those automatically fill in for you. The things you need to change are possibly the commission. The commission might need to be changed. Tax percent, the tax percentage, not necessarily the taxes, but if you change the percentage, it'll do the prorations for you. And you get that by looking at the tax records. So you plug that in. and any concessions that the buyer may have. And honestly, just about every seller's net sheet that I did, I included at least 3.5% seller's commission concessions, at least that, because most transactions are FHA. So you're generally going to have that. So almost every one of them I did, I included that so the seller could see that it doesn't come. We're trying to set expectations when we do this, so we want to hit that. But again, I highlighted that because they need to know that it's going to cost them something. Based on what you know, those of you that have experience, if I was selling my home at $100,000, just rule of thumb, what's my estimated net sheet going to look like? What's my estimated cost for selling my home? $100,000, just real quick, just rule of thumb, what's it going to cost me to sell my property? Anybody?
I always say 8%.
Awesome. Thanks, ma'am. And who is the other one?
I was going to say about 10 to 12,000. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks, Brian. So, and for those of you that's fairly new at this, please understand, like when I'm in there usually around 10%. If it's 100,000, 150, and that includes commission. I don't throw that out, but a lot of times they'll say, well, does that include the commission? Yes, it does. So they think that's a pretty good deal. The higher the price, the lower the percentage. The higher, so when you get into 300,000 or et cetera, you might see about 8%, right? Because the only thing that's going to go up is the commission and the title policy. Most of the other fees are all the same. It doesn't matter if it's a $50,000 property or a $500,000 property. Those fees are generally about the same, depending on the title company. And that's when I say the rule of thumb. A lot of times when you start talking to somebody about the possibility of selling their home, they're going to ask what it costs, and they're not just asking about commission. So, and for us, in my opinion, it's a lot easier to stay away from that. Generally speaking, it's going to cost you about $10,000 or 10% to sell your property. Then they'll follow it up. They will follow it up with, does that include commission? Because if you say commission and this and that, and to them it's a whole lot, right? So just a technique, that's all. Broker's compensation earned. If the seller breaches that listing, they still owe the company. And that's a paragraph that we might want to just touch base on, based on some of the things that we're seeing, because I read a thread this morning. Buyer submitted an offer. Listing agent notified the buyer's agent last night at 9:30 that the offer was, buyer submitted the offer was accepted yesterday at 9:30 last night. The listing agent notifies the buyer's agent that the sellers decided not to sell. Buyers are flying into Austin from Colorado today in preparation of doing inspections, but the sellers decided not to sell, right? And one of the mistakes, and this is another thing for all of you, please don't put anything in writing unless, because that agent had actually text the buyer's agent that the sellers decided not to sell. And this is the fourth time they've done that. That's a problem. So reading through some of that, make sure the seller understands that if you read through this paragraph, and it's not up to us as agents, it's always up to the broker on how this works. I've never seen a broker personally argue with a seller if something went wrong. It depends on whether it's earned and how it's worked, right? But just know that I would touch base based on the way things are going today. The fact that if you breach the contract, you're still responsible for this and this, just to give them a heads up. Make sure we're having that conversation. Broker's compensation is not payable. However, if there's other things there, like due to the foreclosure or the seller can't sell it because of something outside of their control, like somebody who's having title issues, there's things that the seller has absolutely no control over in some cases. The result of casualty loss, right? The storm comes in and they can't afford to fix it. If the seller can't fix it, they can't fix it. That's, so we don't get paid unless that transaction actually happens in that case, right? Then you also have breach by the buyer. And this is one of those things. I've only seen it happen once, but We had a contract on a property. The buyer decides to terminate it at the last minute, like 2 days before closing. I was the listing agent. The broker, we do a release of earnest money to the seller. And the broker said they wanted half of it, which is exactly what it says right here. And until that happened, I had never really discussed that with sellers. But it states right there that the broker can keep half of that commission, half of that earnest money, right? So just know that it's there. And in the case that I'm talking about, it was a situation where, like I said, we had gone down to 2 days before closing. It was not my choice; it was the broker's. It's the only time I've ever done it. But both sides were in house, and the broker decided to keep that, which is an opportunity. Service providers. I highlighted utilities because if you guys are giving out reliance information, which I share quite a bit, even in the classes and stuff, because I like the service. I like what they've built with this, and our reps been doing a pretty good job based on what I can see. Do we get anything out of that? And the answer is, maybe sometimes, if nothing else, maybe a discounted rate. But I know for a while he was giving out rewards or rewards for material items or things you could get. If you're getting anything like that, make sure you've disclosed that. Reimbursable expenses. Not seeing this very often, but on reimbursable expenses, in some cases, specifically the island, for example, they'll have in there, if this listing is terminated before the expiration date, the seller is responsible for reimbursing $250 or $500, whatever it is, for photos. Obviously, if you're going to have that in there, that means you're going to get professional photos completed so that there's an expense there. That's reimbursable expenses. So if I pay a photographer to go out there $250 to take pictures, I don't get that money back unless they terminate. And that's because that would be part of our commission to begin with, right? But that is being used in, like I said, at the island, I see it quite a bit. And there's nothing wrong with it. Just making sure that they know about it. Protection period, we've talked about that. That's a lousy 30, but that was supposed to be 30 days. Just an idea as far as days. You can take a look at what you need to do and what you feel comfortable with, in my opinion. But to make that 30 days even work, I have to give the seller within 10 days, I have to give them a written notice of everybody that's seen the property or the people that I think have seen the property during my listing, that they or a relative. That's why I highlighted relative there. If they or a relative purchases that property, then the owner owes us a commission. But to make that work, I have to give them a list within 10 days of everybody that's seen it while we had it listed, or those that I think are worth putting on that list. The other thing is, if they relist it with a realtor, all bets are off. You get absolutely nothing. So if my listing expires today, and I know it's going to expire, and I give you, the seller, a list of names, say if any of these people buy anything, you still owe us the commission from our listing agreement within the next 30 days. And tomorrow they list with Marcy, then even if somebody that sees it today puts an offer in tomorrow, I get nothing. Everybody understand that, right? So we need to make sure that we're using that, but make sure you're doing everything else if you're going to keep up with it. All right, there's in the chat, Caesar put some information in there for the referral side, so you guys have some bullets on it. All right, so again, I'm just going to cover some of the highlight things. If you have something you want to add in here, please do so. Listing services. Notice regarding public marketing, and this is something that came about last year, really important, that anytime we need to make sure the seller understands that when we take that listing, if there's any kind of public marketing, it has to be in MLS the next business day, period. And I think that's pretty much across the board. I absolutely know it is in McAllen. So, and the example I've used in the past is if I went to get a listing, when I left that house, I put a sign in the yard. Right? I have a sign listing, so I'm going to put a sign in the yard. Today, the only problem with that is it has to be in MLS tomorrow. And sometimes, honestly, I didn't do that because before we had 3 days or 5 days or whatever, and now we don't have that. Right? Please make sure that you, and I highlighted the things on here that I thought you might want to take a look at. Anything you do that's going to generate interest in that, yard signs, digital marketing, websites, that's public marketing. And it needs to be in MLS. If the seller, so A1B, sometimes when I'm going through contracts, I just laugh at some of the things I see, because you see how this has A right here, and it has 1 right here. Then we have B down here. So I should probably mark A1, and then if I needed to, mark B. But both of those should be marked. Would you agree? Right? If that's what I was going with. Or it could be A1 and A. My point is, it's like an outline. They go together. And the amount of times where I'll come in here and I'll see there's a 1 here, for example, and nothing will be marked there, but they'll have something marked down here. It's just a part of it. It's just a part of it.
Matt,
Yes.
on that, what you were just talking about on the one up above about marketing it.
Yes.
I know that at the state meeting when I went to that particular thing, I think we all need to be aware that there's really, the enforcement comes from within. Like if there is somebody who is always sticking their signs out, or they're putting coming soon, or they're doing any of that stuff, and we all know they're not supposed to be doing that. The only way for any kind of checks and balances to be done on this, if we have to report it, and you can report it anonymously at the state level. You can report it to your MLS board. But those things, we really do need to have a checks and balances on that, because there's a lot of people that do coming soon. That's illegal now. You can't do that anymore. So once that property, as soon as you do that, you better have a sign in the yard to have it in MLS so that anybody can do it. And I think that we need to monitor ourselves. I ran into a property that the lady called me and said, could you come look at my house? And I go there and look. Well, there's an agent sign in her yard. It is not in MLS. It is not anywhere. And this guy has his sign out there, and it looks like it's been there a while. And it's like, I called him immediately and said, you need to get that in MLS or get your sign out of her yard. She thinks you're marketing. You're not. So, I mean, we all have to monitor and get rid of that kind of, we don't want to look like used car salesmen. We are professionals, and we need to make sure with the checks and balance, we all act like one.
Thanks, Candy. I appreciate that. Absolutely. So one of the things that in doing that, if you take a listing on a Friday, it's the next business day. Business day is what that rule is, right? So if I take a listing on a Friday, my next business day is going to be Monday, right? So we need to make sure that we understand how that works. If I take a listing on Thursday, my next business day is going to be Friday. So again, that comes from within the marketing. On this one, on B, if the seller instructs the broker not to file the listing with the MLS until so many days after this date, like occasionally they want to clean the place up or whatever, there's nothing wrong with that. You can do that. You just cannot market the property. It cannot be shown. You can't put a sign in the yard. You can't do anything that makes it look like the property's for sale, right? And that's one of the areas, just like Candy's talking about, there's agents that are using that in other areas that I'm aware of, where they'll put it in coming soon. We don't, McAllen does not have a coming soon. We've beat that up quite a bit. I wanted to do it because I've seen other places that do it, but we just never materialized. Part of that's because of the way the MLS is structured and et cetera. But if the seller wants to do this, there's nothing wrong with this. You can still do this. Just don't put anything out there marketing the property until you're ready to hit the market, right? It's not designed to create a buzz and then all of a sudden go, oh, look at me, I sold this house in one day on the market, right? That's not what it's created for. And then we take a look at notice regarding MLS rules. And again, that's the rules for MLS require us to also make changes within the MLS. So if the property goes pending, we're supposed to do that. If it gets sold, we're supposed to do that. If you're the listing agent, you're supposed to go in there and put this information in there. If there's seller's concessions, please put that information in. The appraisers use that to help establish we should be using it within our CMAs. So let's make sure that we have all the information in there that's supposed to be in there. And if you're the listing agent, by the way, and you'll hear me say it all the time, if you're the listing agent, you put everything you know about that property in MLS to begin with. And then this part, let's make sure that we're doing the things so that it's accurately is showing up accurate within the MLS. The broker will not file. If you ever have one of these, let's talk about it, because one of the problems, I've never had one since I've been in the business where an owner said, I don't want this in your MLS. Never had one. I have been in an office where that has happened. And in my mind, it comes back to the listing agent. It's how are you going to sell the property if you don't put it in MLS, right? And granted, you could still market the property. You could still probably find a buyer today with social media and everything else. But the idea is to use MLS, not just for the marketing, but so that we have a history of what the market is doing as well. Everybody good there? All right. So the seller understands, and this is a part I have highlighted, it's underlined, it's in bold. Let's say the seller says, don't put it in MLS. I don't want anybody to know that I'm moving. Now, I have seen individuals say, don't put a sign in the yard. I've seen that because I don't want the neighbors to know I'm selling. When cars start showing up in the middle of the afternoon, they're going to know something's going on, right? I mean, you're not going to keep that a secret. But again, I haven't dealt with that personally. I just know that I've seen agents that have had that issue for one reason or another. If we don't put it in MLS and the property gets marketed, then we have to put it in MLS. And it comes back to the broker is going to be responsible for that, right? That's the way it's designed. Definitions, listing content. Have that conversation with the seller that everything you do, photographs, everything you write up, anything you do on here belongs to the broker. That's when we talk about definitions, everything there belongs to the broker. And we want to make sure that they understand that. And the seller is granting the broker the non-exclusive, royalty-free license to use this stuff. So, because one of the case studies that we had on this was out of Waco, I believe it was, where the I don't actually remember the exact location, but the seller had provided the agent with some photos, said, here, I took these pictures, these are my pictures, you can use them. When the agent put them out, the photographer came after the agent. If the seller provides something, I want to absolutely make sure they understand that when you give this to me, I'm assuming you have the right to do that, right? And that's an area that we don't want to get into, so we have to have this conversation with them. It's not that big of a deal. Just make sure you have that conversation. Should be all right, at least based on what I've seen. Then we come down to the key box. If it's tenant occupied, we need to have 1411 signed by the tenants. The fact that the seller signed it is signed the listing agreements is put the property on the market, and they in the listing agreement they give us permission to put a lockbox on. That's great, but the tenant has the rights to that property for the inside of that property. And if anything comes up wrong, missing or whatever, we need a backup. And the backup is them giving us permission to get in there. And that's 1411. Make sure we have those on any rental property that's tenant occupied that we're going to be going into. If a property is tenant occupied, let me back up. If a rental property is not occupied, there's no tenant in there, then we obviously don't need that form, right? If it's not occupied, can we let anybody in to see that property without us escorting them? This isn't to start a problem with anything, but if a rental property is vacant, if a rental property is vacant, there's actually a form that the seller signs saying that we can authorize, the seller authorizing us to give access to an unaccompanied person in a rental property. If it's vacant, there's a form for that. Personally, after dealing with repos for years, they were vacant and still got vandalized. Me personally, I'm not going to give somebody access to somebody else's property, but I just want to make sure you guys know that there is a form there if it's not occupied, where the seller can authorize that if they wanted to. I've never used it. It's only been in play, I think, maybe about 4 years. But know that it's in there if that subject comes up. You might want to have that conversation, not only with the seller, but with Norma and make sure that we are okay with that, where we're at and what's going on with it. Number 8, broker will offer to pay the other broker a fee. Now that's specifically stated in our listing agreement. And again, these are some of the things that we may see changed over the next year. But I wanted to touch base on 2 things here. One is this: A is an MLS participant. B is non-MLS. But yet a lot of times when I look at listing agreements, what we'll have is they'll have this one blank right here filled out and nothing else. And the reason I wanted to touch base on it today is because everything a consumer signs or initials, they're supposed to be getting a copy of. Everything they sign or initial, they're supposed to be getting a copy of. If I only have the top portion filled out, that means I am going to share it with somebody else within the MLS or the brokerages, right? And that's it. I don't have the seller's permission to share commission with anybody else, period, based on that. Does that make sense? So know what you're filling out. Every time I filled this out, I would have all 4 of these filled out. So the question then is, what the heck is subagent? Who can tell us how subagent works?
Come on, guys.
Besides Norman.
A subagent is someone who does not have a buyer's representation agreement with the customer they brought to your property. So they automatically, by Texas rules, are a subagent to the seller.
That's pretty darn good.
Thank you.
That's pretty good. And that part, and the reason why I wanted to touch base there is because let's say Gustavo has a listing, because he has 1 or 2 of them. But let's say Gustavo has a listing, right? And I have a buyer that wants to take a look at it. And I talk to the buyer, I give them the information about brokerage services. I talk to them about being represented. They go, no, I don't need to be represented. They are a customer. They're a customer. We don't have intermediary. They're a customer. That's all they are. And that's another part of, if you will, kind of the sub-agency. We're both, Gustavo and myself would both be working for the seller in that situation, because the buyer's nothing more than a customer. Does that make sense? Right? So the other part of it, when we talk about non-MLS, we have that throughout the valley, but yet I'll see transactions where the listing agreement has absolutely nothing in B, but it's an agent at, just as an example, it's an agent at the island, it's the listing agent, and an agent from McAllen is the buyer's agent. Now that agent from McAllen, if they don't belong to that MLS, they shouldn't be getting paid based on a blank listing agreement. Does that make sense? And was that message conveyed? And not trying to muddy things up, just make sure that we are clear on where we are at. So if for example, I had a listing, I belong to the GMAR, right? I have a listing in McAllen, and somebody from the island comes over that's not a member of the MLS. They bring a buyer, and I don't have that bottom one filled out, and I'm aware of it. then I also want to shoot in an amendment to the listing to the seller to give us permission to do that. Right? Because I mean, there's nothing wrong with sharing, just make sure we have the documentation to go with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Mac, let me just add to that, that ideally we want to take care of that on the front end, and you want to be doing the same thing for all of your listings, not sort of cherry picking the one
Yes.
listing or two listings out of the 5 or 10 that you have that you don't want to share this equal amount of commission. So rather than doing an amendment, if that's something, and obviously it's more of an issue in areas like the island, not so much of an issue in McAllen, but if that's, and the reason, just to clarify that because some of you guys might be wondering, why would I pay less? And I know we're talking about subagent here, I think I'm talking more about the non-MLS brokers,
Right.
as opposed to just a subagent. But some of you guys might be wondering, why would we pay less to like a non-MLS broker? Because a lot of times agents that are not here will tell you, hey, can you go open up this property for my client? Can you send me a CMA? I don't have access to MLS. Can you do all, and we end up with a larger workload. And if that's the case and you're comfortable doing that, I would say that just do it across the board with all your listings. Don't pick and choose, and just get into the habit of doing it when you list the property to begin with. So you don't have to go back and it doesn't look like you're just, doing a bait and switch or something like that. So
Awesome. That is so good. Thanks, Norma. Appreciate that. Because that comes into another area, which, why did you do it here and not there, and all the other things that are going on in society right now with fair housing and other issues also. Cool. Anybody have any questions there? All right.
Mac, I might add one thing, because Norma, she hit it right, the nail on the head, because I've had that happen several times. Sometimes you get a muck, I always say, call them big muckety mucks, but you get some kind of a CEO or somebody for the hospital or some big person that comes down here, like from Austin or someplace else in Texas, and you're showing them property, and suddenly somebody pops up out of Austin. They say, oh, but this is my agent Austin. She's going to write the contract for me. And if you have not done, if you don't have everything all set up ahead of time, just like Norma says, on every single contract, I at least put 2.5 on non-MLS, because, and you can, I always do that, because you always end up doing way more work. You always do, because you're ended up doing all the work, and you want to sell the property for your seller. You do not want to get into a fight, and you just, you pay a little bit less because you're going to do all the footwork. You're going to do all the footwork. And it's happened to me several times during my years. And I think it's always a smart idea. Just cover yourself.
Exactly. Just get into the habit of doing it. And it's okay to just tell your sellers at the time of listing, hey, we're going to put a lesser amount here, and this is why. And you just explain why. And if you do it ahead of time, there's usually never an issue.
All right. Everybody good? Awesome. All right. So then let's take a look at the intermediary status real quick. We already talked about this a little bit. Appointed associate, if they're going to be appointed, they're going to provide opinions and advice. It tells you right in the listing agreement, opinions and advice if they're appointed. And it breaks it down how that's going to work. And appoint the associate, then servicing the buyer to the same, to that prospect for the same purpose, to give advice and opinions. If the broker represents, if a prospective buyer that the broker represents is serviced by the same associate, which is what we see sometimes, same associate. So I, as a listing agent, have also have a buyer rep with this buyer, and I'm going out doing things. It walks you through going out showing property and stuff. It walks you through what should happen, right? Appoint another associate to communicate with, carry out instructions, and provide opinions during negotiations. And that's why I hit that earlier. Advice and opinions is absolutely critical. That's what they're paying us for, right? Give them some direction on what needs to be done. Or the broker may notify the seller that we're not going to do appointments. And that's where that sheet comes into play, right? The notice of intermediary. That's where that comes into play. And making sure that's filled out correctly. Make sure that's filled out correctly and that the right boxes are marked. and we get their signatures on it. In such an event, they're going to work as the broker's intermediary, but will not give advice and opinions. Will not. Everybody good there? All right. And then this one, some of you heard me talk about this when we talk about when we're talking to the seller about what's going on financially and what to look for. This is just a matter of opinion, is all this is. But when I, as a listing agent, want to put things in MLS, I want to put as much information in as possible. My job is to get a bite, right? Get somebody to react to it. And there's agents out there that will do searches based on financial, what works. The buyer's qualified for FHA, great. They'll go into MLS and not just look for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, but they'll look for something that's been labeled as FHA. As a buyer's agent, I wouldn't do that, but there's some that do. And that's why as a listing agent, I want to, and that's, you can go back and look at almost every listing I ever had, all 5 of these would be marked. All 5 of them would be marked. And I'd explain to the seller, the other issue with this is VA and FHA, you might be asked to pay some of the buyer's closing costs, and listen to that for a little bit. But at least we have an offer. And if we get an offer, we can negotiate. Without an offer, we have nothing. So please allow me to use this to try to generate some offers. Does that make sense? And most of them, when it gets down to it, if you do the net sheet and work with it, most of them are pretty workable, at least over the years. That's one of the things I'd seen. One of the things here, now in this paragraph right here, we're talking about MLS rules. The broker may disclose whether the seller is considering more than one offer. So we can tell somebody that the seller is looking at more than one offers as long as we have it in writing, right? And the broker will not discuss the terms of the competing offers unless specifically instructed by the seller. And that's what I was talking about earlier. Today, one of the practices in some of the bigger areas is to get the seller's authorization to release multiple offer information so that I can give it to the appraiser. Let the appraiser know that, hey, we've got 5 offers. They're all about the same price. That's telling the appraiser that price is a good price. Does that make sense? Right? And that's in a podcast. I think I shared it last week. That's in a podcast with NAR right now on appraisals. It's just a technique to try to help overcome some of the issues on appraisals. Seller represents that the pool and spa will be, if it's required to be enclosed, it's going to be enclosed. It's going to be lashed. We have no responsibility if anything goes wrong there. I want to make sure that we are covered. If I was listing a home that had a pool, I want to make sure that they understand where we're at there. By the way, Mr. and Ms. Seller, are you current? Are you current on everything? And when I say everything, I'm talking about your mortgage, your taxes, your property taxes, anything you might have an impact on the property. Is there anything that might cause us an issue when it comes time to sell that property? And the way I just gave it to you is probably the way I ask it 99% of the time. And I had one that couldn't close because he had an IRS issue and never bothered to mention it to anybody. And it became an issue because the contract said the seller was going to pay for some of the buyer's closing costs. And the IRS stepped in and said, no, you're not. That's our money. So without the closing costs, the buyer said they couldn't buy it, so it fell apart. On J here, when it's talking again, we're talking about content, right? Do not violate or infringe on any copyright laws. We want to make sure that we have the right information, make sure the seller understands that there could be some issues there. We want to make sure that we have all the information to do what needs to be done. And by the way, Mr. and Ms. Seller, this is your property. You can do whatever you want to with it. But if you do anything that's going to change, like lease the property out, you're going to make sure that I know about it before you do that. And again, that doesn't always work. There's been times where I've had sellers call and say, hey, Mac, just so you know, we just leased the property out. Yeah, I don't know what the word before means, but it'd be nice to have known that beforehand, because that changes how things are going to happen. Not negotiate. The seller agrees to not negotiate with anybody else without letting us know about it. Let us do our job. Provide the broker with copies of any leases or rental agreements. We now have an addendum that covers that as well. It's already been in the listing agreement, right? We are supposed to get copies of any of this stuff that they have. And we're now, that's really important because now we have the addendum that says we have to have it. We have to provide it to them within so many days or they can terminate the contract. So if the property is being leased, we need to make sure we have that information up front. And Mr. and Ms. Seller, this also says that you will complete all disclosures, which includes the seller's disclosure notice. On this one right here, if the property is vacant, I just had this conversation the other day with an agent. If a property is vacant, the seller may want to call their insurance company and make sure that they know about it because there could be an issue there with the insurance company if the property is vacant. Minor thing, not something major, at least as far as I know. Then again, we have the default in there. If the seller breaches the listing, what can happen? And this takes us back to paragraph 5, compensation, etc. And also if we breach that. Can the listing agreement be terminated? Mutually, yes, right? But you might want to talk to somebody before you do that. Let's try to save it if at all possible. I should include the seller's disclosure notice. I should include the T47. By the way, that's another thing that's in that podcast. If I'm the listing agent, the seller has a survey, even if we're not using the survey in this transaction, please include the old survey in the packet that you provide the appraiser. Please include the old survey in the packet that you provide the appraiser, that you're going to email the appraiser. And you can scan it in. One of the key things that was mentioned is so that the appraiser can check the legal description on the survey in accordance with the tax records and also look at the properties. Condominium addendum. If I'm listing a property that's a condominium, we started at the very beginning. We talked about the fact that that's supposed to be there. If it's a condominium, we need that. And of course, the seller's authorization to release. We've talked about that form. If we're going to use it, make sure that we check the box to mean that it's included. This agreement may not be changed except by written agreement. Now, this says agreement, but the attorneys say that once this is signed by both parties, it becomes a contract, right? Which means we have to sign it also. And again, that's one of the areas, if there's a weakness on the listing side, that's probably one of those areas. Agents will have a listing, and again, this is not in the mission office at all, but we'll see it from time to time in other places where we have a listing agreement, but the agent never signed it. And if you didn't sign it, it makes me wonder, did I provide a copy to my client? Right? And if I did, was it an unsigned copy? In accordance with the fair housing, we're going to do things the right way, right? No discrimination, which ties, that's what I was getting at earlier when Norma threw that out. It was so good. Advises the seller to contact a mortgage lender. You need to find out what your payoff amount is. Could what they think is owed and their payoff amount be different? Yes, right? Some places may, in Texas, for a regular home mortgage today, you're not supposed to have a prepayment penalty, but in some cases, depending on how they bought the house, that may be a case. I seen one several years ago where the gentleman told me initially there's not, but when he researched it, it was with Chase. When he researched it, he found out he did have. And the other part is there may not be a prepayment penalty, but what you think you owe was probably without interest. And if it's 20 days later, there's going to be some interest tacked onto there. So that's not going to be the real payoff. Contact your lender. Let's find out what the payoff will be for this date. Consult an attorney for the seller. Consult an attorney if you're going to use any kind of surveillance device. And be aware that the buyer may photograph your property. We can't control what the buyer does inside the property. Normally, if I was the buyer's agent, I would ask before I did that or allow my client to do that. But we can't control it. So we need to make sure the seller knows that the buyer may be taking photographs while in the property. if you're the buyer's agent, I wouldn't do that personally without asking, but lead-based payment addendum, we know how that works for the biggest part. For those that are here, we're good to go there, I believe. Make sure we're providing that pamphlet. Make sure the buyer has a 10-day window to check things out if they want to. If we're doing the lead-based payment addendum the way it's supposed to be done, that's on there. We're going to talk about that. We should talk about it. What if the seller's a foreign person? And again, this is one of those boxes, yes or no, right? We need to ask that question so we know what we're working with.
I have a question about that, Mac.
Sure.
Okay, what about, I have bumped into Mexican nationals that in some point during their life here in the United States, they grab a working visa and they was given a social, but then that visa was revoked and they're back in Mexico. They can come back and forward. And I have bumped into people say, no, don't worry. I'm a Mexican, but I have a social security. That we get in trouble because we ask and we know, and they're telling us that they're foreign, but they have a social. Now, I don't know if during the time that we're selling the property, that social is like current here in the United States, or they're not, I don't know. But I have bumped into that I know that they're not here anymore, but they do have a social, and they gave that to the title company. They get away for that, for what the property retention. So
Right.
I don't know. It's always my concern if we have any kind of a liability on that stuff.
Right. So my advice to you would be, make sure this last paragraph says, consult a tax professional. Tell the seller to consult a tax professional. If they have a social security number, the social security number is not going to go away, right? I mean, what I mean by that is it's not, it doesn't have an expiration date. In fact, I just went through that, that part of that. The social security number does not expire. If they were issued one, it's still there. Their citizenship might be a different issue, and there may be some tax questions there, but the other thing is that I would toss out is, and you guys have heard me say that before, I would just go to the title company that I'm planning on using and see what they want me to do. They have attorneys. Like if I walk into the title company over here and I go, here's what I have. What should I do? Most of the time she'll go, hold on a second, let's call the attorney. And she'll call them right then and there. We'll do a conversation on what needs to happen. That works best rather than trying to second guess it, in my opinion. And if you go to Texas Realtors, they're going to tell you that they're a foreign person. They're probably not going to answer any other questions because it's a tax issue, in my opinion. Anybody have anything else on there?
Thank you.
Sure. The other part is make sure that here's an opportunity for us to talk to them about, do not transmit anything, period, electronically without talking to me. I don't care if you get an email from somebody that says their title company, a mortgage lender, the buyer's agent, I don't care where it comes from. If anybody asks you to send them something, your payoff, your loan company, anything, talk to me immediately. And the last part of this, if you would, right here at the bottom, we have the broker's printed name. And generally speaking, what I see is Remax Elite. And we should have the 9,000 number in most cases. The broker associate's signature is what we should probably have, which means our name is down here on the bottom. And where I have that little red squiggly is where we would be signing. And again, this is something that I see from time to time. We have a listing agreement, but no signature. The seller signed it, but not the agent. So you don't really have a contract. And in general, not to be negative by no means, but in general, if you don't have a contract, do they really owe the company any money? The answer is no. I would not want to be that agent. Everybody good there? All right. And once again, as we looked at, there were some addendums that changed as well. And those were very just basic paragraph changes in forms that might be used on the listing side. The property owner's agreement changed. They just changed the fees and dues and all that. They put it all together in the new one. Instead of having 2 paragraphs, they have it all in one. So that part shouldn't be a problem. On the 24th at 1 o'clock, 24th at 1 o'clock for 1 hour, we're going to do 1 hour of CE. We'll do it for, it's free. I'll send out an email for it, and we are going to do just contract changes. Just contract changes, and walk through the 1 to 4 family and some of the attachments that are there, some of the addenda that goes with it. Anybody have anything else? So please remember, when we started this, the paragraph that changed was the one about accessories and the improvements in accessories. They took out property owned by the owner, and they took out satellites here. That's the 2 red items. And then they put in the blue portion of it. Seller's transferable rights, software applications, all of that. And on the new contract, it says that we are supposed to tell the seller to remove all those applications from their phones and all those devices and etc. One of the easiest ways to do that is have them just set everything back to the default, right? And then have the buyer put their new passwords and stuff in there immediately. That should eliminate a lot of the issues. Anybody have anything else? Awesome. For those of you who came in a little later, when we first started, one of the things I threw out was do not allow somebody who's unlicensed to see a property. That's so important. And that came up on Trek's disciplinary action, where an agent actually gave the access code to a consumer who is not licensed. And that showed up as a Trek complaint for the last month as well. We want to make
Mac, I
sure.
have a question on that.
Sure. Yeah.
What about the appraisers or inspectors? Do they have access to showing time? Because I've gotten calls or text messages from appraisers and inspectors wanting me to give them the access code for Supra. I mean, they can open them, but can they schedule the appointments through showing time, or how do we do that?
Most of them are members of the MLS, right? So they have access to the same tools you have. In fact, that's one of the big pushes by another instructor, is they're also a member of the board, which means they're actually a realtor. So we have to be careful how we talk about appraisers and all that good stuff. But they have access to the MLS, so they should be able to do that. I'm just not sure if they're not doing it. It's probably just due to a lack of education and not wanting to mess with it. I've heard some of them say, one in particular, it's easier just to pick up the phone, right? So, but if you
Mac, what about an insurance agent?
an insurance agent,
Yes, I got a call yesterday from an insurance agent wanting to see the property. My buyer is buying a property, and they're insuring the property, so they were able to see the property on the outside, and I think they needed to get to the back of the house.
they're not licensed through Trek. Like appraisers are licensed, inspectors are licensed, we are licensed. If they're not licensed through Trek, we don't give them access to the inside. We can run over and open it up for them, but not free access.
Last I heard, I think they want pictures right before closing, especially after the freeze we got and everything that's been going on with the weather. I think they just want pictures like a couple days before closing. And that's
Right. Yeah, that's the same thing I've seen too. Anybody else?
So do we ask the agent, the insurance agent, if they're licensed? Do we look them up? That's weird.
They're not going to be licensed in Trek in most cases. I mean, you can look them up. I look up agents all the time. If I get a contract, in fact, there was somebody who was asking about giving a code to somebody, and that was the first thing I thought about. If I get an offer as an agent, if I got an offer from somebody and I don't know their name, I look them up on Trek's website. And I highly encourage all of you to do that. If you don't know them, look them up. We had a situation years ago here in Harlingen where we looked up, it wasn't my offer, it was somebody else in the office, looked that agent up, and they had an expired license for 3 months. Had an expired license for 3 months, and they were still practicing. We can't get sucked into that. So as an insurance agent, if you ask them and if you don't ask the right questions, you're going to end up with the possibility of some issues. You know, are you licensed? Yes, they're licensed, but they're licensed for insurance. That's a whole different ballgame.
And they're usually wanting to do all that for the buyer. So if you're the buyer's agent, just go open the door for them, or if it's your listing, have the buyer's agent go open the door for them if they need access.
Absolutely. Yep. Sounds great. And when I say you ask them the right questions, that's I've shared with a couple of you before that I had an agent from Dallas that had shown a property, had requested to show a property, and when they called, they said, I need to get the access code so I can get into the property. I'm like, well, aren't you an agent? He goes, yes. I go, oh, so you don't belong to, at that time, you don't belong to the Harlingen MLS, you belong to McAllen. I said that. And he didn't respond. So I said, hold on. I said, hold on a minute. Let me get it for you. And I gave him a code to get in. He didn't belong to either one of the MLSs. He belonged to Dallas. Right. And he showed it. He gave that code to the buyer. The buyer looked at the property. He wrote up an offer and sent it to me. When I got it, I'm like, man, that was quick. How did you do that when you're not even at the office? He goes, oh, I am at the office in Dallas. Like, how did you get the buyer in? Oh, I gave them the code. And it was because I didn't ask the right questions, right? So just know that that's what we need to work with. All right, anybody have anything else? Last call. Yeah, we're out of here. All right, we'll see you guys later. Have a great day.
Thanks, Mac.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, guys.
Thank you, Matt.
¿Va a haber hamburguesas?
Siempre sales con algo, Gustavo.
Bye.